I was standing in my backyard with a garden hose in my right hand. The water hit the soil in a steady line, darkening the dirt around the tomato plants. It was the same spot I watered every weekend. Same angle. Same pressure. Flip-flops on concrete. An old college t-shirt I'd had for years. I didn't hear a knock. I heard the side gate. Metal on metal. A latch lifting. Footsteps on gravel. I turned my head and saw a uniform moving through the narrow space between the fence and the house. Officer Ryan Mitchell didn't announce himself. He didn't stop at the gate. He walked straight in, as the decision had already been made somewhere else. His body camera was on. I could see the red indicator light. His right hand settled on his holster, not gripping the weapon, just resting there. Close enough. Put the hose down, he said. The tone wasn't raised. It wasn't shouted. It was flat. Procedural. I looked at the hose. I looked back at him. Then I set it on the ground slowly, the water still running for a second, before I twisted the nozzle shut with my foot. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "This is my house," I said. "I live here." He looked past me. Not at my face. His eyes moved across the yard. The fence line. The back of the house. Then back to me. "This house doesn't really match," he said. "Doesn't match what?" I asked. "You," he said. "I got a call." He shifted his weight slightly. His hand stayed where it was. "I'm the homeowner," I said. "My ID is inside." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he said, "You don't look like the owner." That was the first moment I noticed something specific. The camera was recording, but nothing had been framed yet. No explanation of entry. No stated reason for presence. No verbal acknowledgement of private property. Just control. "I'm Michael Carter," I said. "This is my address." He shook his head once. Small and dismissive. I hear that story a lot. Then he glanced down at the garden beds again and said, almost casually, "You, gardening for someone." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was familiar, like a line that had been used before. I kept my hands visible. "I'm watering my plants," I said. He took a step closer. "For safety reasons," he said. "I need you to stay right there." The phrase landed exactly where it was meant to. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, just a pause with weight behind it. I asked if he had a warrant. He said, "I don't need one. I'm responding to a suspicious activity call." From that moment on, it stopped being my space. My ability to move freely in my own yard was no longer mine. It had been temporarily reassigned. I told him again that my wallet was inside. I said I could retrieve it slowly. He said no. "Relax," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I wasn't doing anything, but the responsibility for whatever came next had already shifted away from him. Across the street, a voice cut through the space. "Hey," someone called. "That's his house." I looked toward the fence. Daniel Harper stood there, one hand resting on the top rail. He'd lived across from me for over a decade. Our kids had grown up together. "He lives there," Daniel said again. "You've got the wrong guy." Officer Mitchell turned his head toward Daniel, but his body stayed squared to me. "Sir, I need you to step back," he said. Daniel didn't move. "He's lived here for years," Daniel said. "This is a mistake." The officer paused. Not long. Just enough to register the information without accepting it. "I still need to verify," he said. He looked back at me. "You're coming to the front of the house." I nodded once and started walking. Slow and deliberate. He followed closely, just off my shoulder. Close enough that I could hear his breathing change as we moved. At the front door, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. I held them up before inserting one into the lock. The door opened. Inside, the hallway light was on. Framed photos lined the wall. One with the governor, one from a Department of Justice event. A framed appointment letter hung slightly crooked near the entry. Officer Mitchell stopped moving. He didn't say anything at first. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Didn't expect this." I turned to face him. "I'm the United States Attorney for this district," I said, "and everything you've said has been recorded." His hand finally moved away from his holster. The space between us didn't close, but the pressure in it stopped increasing. That was when the record began to matter. Not because it erased what had already happened, but because from that point on, the system couldn't ignore it. Officer Ryan Mitchell didn't step inside. He stayed at the threshold, half in, half out, like the decision still hadn't been finalized. His eyes moved again, slower this time. The framed photos, the letter, the hallway light, nothing changed on the camera. No verbal acknowledgement, no correction, no update to dispatch. Just silence. "Stay right there," he said. I didn't move. From the front window, I could see Daniel Harper still standing by the fence across the street. He hadn't gone back inside. He was watching now, arms crossed, not intervening, just present. Officer Mitchell reached up and touched his radio. He didn't key it yet. He looked back at me instead. "I still need to verify," he said. "Verify what?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "Turn around," he said. "Face the house?" I did. Slowly. Hands still visible. Nothing sudden. From that point on, I wasn't free to move. But I hadn't been told I was detained either. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch," he said. "Can you run a name for me?" He paused, then added my name. "Michael Carter." There was a delay. Static. A few clipped acknowledgments from somewhere else. Other traffic on the channel. Nothing urgent. We stood there. No cuffs. No formal detention announced. But no freedom either. "Step over here," he said, motioning a few feet to the left. I complied. The move didn't change anything except where I was allowed to stand. The radio crackled again. "Say again," dispatch said. Officer Mitchell repeated my name. Another pause. "Is there a problem?" I asked. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Just routine." Routine didn't require standing in your own doorway with your back turned. Routine didn't require keeping someone in place without stating why. But routine covered a lot of ground. Across the street, Daniel shifted his weight. He pulled his phone out, then stopped, unsure whether to use it. Officer Mitchell glanced in his direction. "Sir," he called out, without raising his voice, "you need to head back inside." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't comply either. He stayed where he was. The radio chirped again. "I'm not getting anything back," dispatch said. "Can you confirm the date of birth?" Officer Mitchell turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me from the corner of his eye. "What's your date of birth?" he asked. I told him. He repeated it on the radio. Another pause. At this point, the record was building, but not in my favor. Each unanswered response stretched the time I was expected to wait without explanation. Officer Mitchell shifted his stance. His hand didn't return to his holster, but it stayed close. "Do you have any weapons inside the house?" he asked. "No," I said. "Anyone else home?" "No." He nodded once, as if checking boxes only he could see. "Wait here," he said. Minutes passed. The sun shifted slightly across the porch. The hose lay coiled near the steps where I'd left it. The yard behind me was quiet now, unattended. The radio finally came back. "Ryan," dispatch said. "I'm getting multiple returns. Stand by." "Stand by." Officer Mitchell exhaled through his nose. He didn't respond right away. He looked at the framed appointment letter again, long enough this time that the camera would have captured it if anyone ever reviewed the footage closely. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward the wall. "Yes," I said. He didn't comment. Instead, he keyed the radio again. "Can you send a supervisor to my location?" he said. "Just to be safe. Just to be safe." The phrase justified escalation without naming its cause. "Copy," dispatch replied. We waited. When the patrol cars arrived, they didn't rush. No lights. No sirens. Just doors opening. Radios adjusting. Boots on pavement. Sergeant Laura Bennett approached first. She looked at me. Then at Officer Mitchell. Then at the doorway. Her eyes paused on the letter. She didn't ask questions immediately. What do we have? She asked him. Officer Mitchell spoke quietly. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just factual. Suspicious activity call. He said. Verification still pending. Sergeant Bennett nodded. Then turned to me. Sir. She said. Can you confirm your name? Michael Carter. She looked at Officer Mitchell again. You ran him. Yes. Ma'am. She glanced down at her tablet. Her posture changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to shift the room. Dispatch. She said into her radio. Confirm subject. This time, the response came quickly. Confirmed. Dispatch said. Michael Carter. United States Attorney? There was no reaction from Officer Mitchell. No denial. No explanation. Sergeant Bennett turned the tablet so he could see it. All right, she said. That's confirmed. The space didn't relax immediately, but it stopped tightening. Sir, she said to me. Thank you for your patience. I nodded once. Officer Mitchell stepped back. Not far. Just enough to reset the distance. Nothing was undone. From that point on, every move would be written down. They didn't ask me to stay. After Sergeant Laura Bennett confirmed my identity, the scene dissolved without ceremony. No summary. No closing statement. Officer Ryan Mitchell returned to his unit. The additional patrol cars pulled away one by one. The street went back to its usual shape. What remained was the record. Not a clean one. Not a complete one. Just enough to exist. 2 days later, I requested the body camera footage. The request went through the standard channel. No urgency attached to it. No priority tag. When the footage arrived, the gap was obvious. The video began in the backyard, but not at the gate. The audio captured commands without context. The timestamp aligned with radio traffic, but not with the moment control had started. The first instruction appeared without an entry point. Nothing in the file explained how the contact began. I filed a formal complaint, not a statement. A sequence. Entry without announcement. Commands issued before verification. Delay without detention stated. Confirmation arriving after control had already been exercised. The department acknowledged receipt. A week passed. Then another. When the review was scheduled, it wasn't labeled a hearing. It was called a process review. The wording mattered. The room reflected that choice. White walls. A long table. A screen mounted slightly too high. Bottled water is placed evenly. Untouched. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat on one side with a union representative beside him. Sergeant Bennett was present but not seated at the table. She stood near the back wall. Hands folded. Observing. Internal Affairs handled the questions. They didn't ask why. They asked when. When did you enter the property? When did you issue the first command? When did you request verification? When did dispatch respond? Each question matched a timestamp. The footage played in short segments. Paused. Rewound. Played again? The camera angle showed my shoulders. Not my face. The audio captured tone, not context. No one raised their voice. Officer Mitchell answered evenly, responding to a call. Routine contact. Verification pending. When asked why he hadn't announced himself at the gate, he paused. I believed immediate contact was appropriate. He said, that was the only deviation. Not defensive. Just careful. The review moved on. Daniel Harper's statement was read into the record. He had identified me as the homeowner. He had stated that the officer was mistaken. That information had not altered the interaction. The discrepancy was noted. Not debated. When the footage reached the front doorway, the room shifted. Not emotionally. Procedurally. The framed appointment letter was visible on screen. The audio captured Officer Mitchell's comment. Quiet but clear. Didn't expect this. No one reacted to the words themselves. They reacted to the timing. That sentence came after the commands. After the delay. After control had already been exercised. Internal Affairs marked it without commentary. The findings were released 3 weeks later. Officer Ryan Mitchell was found to have violated departmental policy related to unauthorized entry, escalation management, and documentation standards. The language was narrow. The conclusions were precise. Termination was not recommended. Instead, Officer Mitchell was permanently removed from patrol duty. His authority was restricted to non-public-facing roles. He was reassigned to an administrative position, with no field contact. He was also ordered to complete 5 years of structured sensitivity and bias training. Not a workshop. Not a seminar. A continuous requirement with evaluations, written reports, and compliance reviews. Failure to complete any phase would result in dismissal. There was no press conference. The department issued a brief statement emphasizing procedure and improvement. It did not include my name. The union released its own response, citing due process and contractual protections. Both statements existed at the same time. Neither contradicted the record. I wasn't asked to speak publicly. I chose to release a short statement anyway. Not about the officer. About sequence. I said that control had arrived before confirmation. That correction had followed, not prevented. The outcome. That most people do not have witnesses who intervene, or documentation on their walls, or a supervisor who arrives before the situation shifts further. The department did not respond. Months later, I saw Officer Mitchell again. Not on the street. In a training room. I was visiting as a guest speaker. He sat at a desk near the back. No uniform. No radio. A binder was open in front of him. He didn't look up. I didn't approach. That was the extent of it. Nothing that happened to me was undone. The entry still occurred. The commands were still given. The delay still existed. What changed was what followed. Authority was narrowed. Access was reduced. Actions that once moved without explanation were now tied to review, repetition, and record. If you've watched this far, you already know this didn't end with a reversal. It ended with a limit. At what point should verification stop control? Is reassignment accountability? Or just containment? This is Power Abuse Stories, where authority is examined in the order it's used, not the excuses that follow. If you've seen something similar, leave a comment. Subscribe for more cases where the record matters.